Almost universally, ancient texts and spiritual traditions suggest that everything in our world is connected in ways perhaps that we're only beginning to understand. This field of energy, this subtle field of energy, is in fact described by Western scientists as a net or a web that creates what they call the underlying fabric of all creation. This field of energy has been here from the very beginning. It is an intelligent field, an intelligence that responds deeply to human emotion. We must feel the feeling as if the prayer has already been answered. And in that feeling, we are speaking to the forces of creation, allowing the world to respond to us, allowing this field, the quantum hologram, the mind of God, to respond to us with what it is that we are feeling within our hearts. What would it mean if we discovered that each moment of our lives is part of a conversation, an ongoing dialogue with the universe around us? What if everything that happens in our lives, from the healing in our bodies to the peace of our world, to our marriages, our families, our romances, our divorces, all the things that we see as life in each moment of every day, what if they're a reflection of this intelligence, this field of energy that the ancients described in their language, and now that Western science is beginning to describe in a language that we recognize? Well, a growing body of scientific evidence suggests this is precisely the way that our world works. That the world, in essence, is nothing more and nothing less than a reflection of what we have become from within, our thoughts, feelings, emotions, our beliefs, our prayers. Princeton University physicist John Wheeler suggests precisely this concept in an interview recently. What he said was that we live in what he calls a participatory universe. Rather than thinking of the universe as something that's already created and that we're plopped down in the middle of it having these experiences, what Dr. Wheeler is suggesting is that the universe is a result of what we are doing in our lives. He says we're tiny patches of the universe looking at itself and creating itself along the way. Now, this is a radical concept because it suggests that when we look into the world of the quantum atom for that most minute, ultimate particle, we may never find it. Because every time we look, the act of looking is consciousness, placing, creating, building something there for us to see. And when we look into the expanses, the vast expanses of our universe, searching for the very edge of what we call creation, we may never find it. Because the act of consciousness searching is the creative force that puts something in place. Well, growing body, scientific evidence suggests this is precisely the way our world works. And what we'll find is we discover through the experiments that have been done recently in the 20th century is that the ancients may have been very, very close, in fact, to describing precisely the way our world works in the language of another time. Between 1993 and the year 2000, a series of experiments were conducted in accredited scientific and academic institutions that are now supporting precisely the concepts that the ancients so clearly spelled out in the language of their time. 3 of these representative experiments are absolutely shaking the foundation of everything we now believe about physics and the way our world works, and are in fact suggesting that we are connected through this field of energy. The idea that there may be an all-permeating essence that connects everything is really not so new, even in the world of science. In the late 1800s, there was this tremendous spiritual revolution that was sweeping the earth. And at that time, there was a great debate as to whether or not this field actually exists. And during that time, it was called the ether field. In 1887, a very famous experiment was conducted to demonstrate once and for all, does this field exist or does it not exist? And based on the results of that experiment, Western science, specifically Western physics, has believed that everything that happens in our world is discrete, non-related, isolated things that appear to be happening in the same instant in time are simply coincidence. The very famous Michelson-Morley experiment, the equivalent of the experiment, is if you were to go outside of the building where you are right now and moisten your finger and place it in the air above your head, and in that moment you felt no wind against your finger, and from that concluded that no air exists around you. That's the equivalent of this Michelson-Morley experiment. They believed that if this field actually exists, it must be moving. And when they tested for movement, they found none, and from that concluded that the field doesn't exist. From 1887 until the early 1990s, all of Western science was based on the principle that what happens in one place has absolutely no effect on what happens somewhere else. And now we know that this is absolutely not true. So I'd like to share with you 3 experiments that are absolutely shaking the foundation of Western physics. The first was conducted by a Russian physicist, Vladimir Poponin, in the early 1990s. He came to the United States to finish this series of experiments. And what Poponin did was he wanted to investigate the relationship between human DNA and the stuff our world is made out of, little packets of energy that we call photons, little particles of light, if you want to think of them that way. So the experiment consisted of taking a tube, a glass tube, drawing all the air out of this tube, creating what today we call a vacuum, implying that there's nothing left in this tube. However, we know that there's still something left, these little particles of light. So Poponin measured the particles to see how they were distributed. Did they fly all over the place inside the tube, or were they all accumulated at the bottom, or what happened with them? And the results of this part of the experiment were not surprising, because the little particles of light, the photons, were completely random, and this is what they expected. The next part of the experiment is where this gets really, really interesting, because they placed some human DNA into this tube. And the human DNA, when they remeasured the photons, the human DNA had caused the photons to form an alignment. The DNA was having a direct effect on the stuff our world is made of. Now, this is precisely what ancient spiritual traditions have always said, that something within us has an effect in the world around us. And Poponin's experiment, for the first time in recent times, is actually verifying this under laboratory conditions. And the next piece of the experiment is even more interesting, because what they found was that when the DNA was removed from the tube, we would expect that they would all go back randomly distributed just the way they were before. And this is not what happened. What happened was, even though the DNA was no longer in the tube, the photons remained aligned as if the DNA were still there. And the question is, why? What is it that causes this effect? There's nothing in Western physics that accounts for why those photons should remain in the position that they were in when the DNA that caused them to become aligned is now removed from the tube. This experiment is called the phantom DNA experiment because the effects last whether the DNA is there or not. And what it tells us is, number one, is that DNA is communicating, human DNA is communicating with the stuff our world is made of, the packets of energy that underlie all of matter. It's communicating through a field that has previously been unrecognized. The scientists call it a new field. My sense is it's probably been there all along, and we simply didn't recognize it. So we'll call this a previously unrecognized form of energy. The second experiment is a fascinating experiment. It's a military experiment. And what they did, in essence, was they took some human DNA, some scrapings from the tissue of inside the mouth of a donor or volunteer, and they placed this DNA in a device that could measure its effects in one room of a building, while the donor that the DNA came from is in another room in the same building. So living DNA from one person, the DNA is in one place, the volunteer is in another place. And what they did was they subjected the volunteer to what they called emotional stimulation that would elicit genuine responses of emotion, of joy or sadness or fear or anger or rage, in one part of the building, and they were measuring the DNA to see if the DNA would affect to the donor's emotions. Now, why would it? In Western physics today, there's absolutely nothing that suggests that that DNA is still linked to the donor, on the one hand. And on the other hand, as they conducted these experiments, what they found was just the opposite. What they found was that when the donor was having his emotional peaks and valleys in one room, the DNA was having its emotional peaks and valleys in another room at exactly the same time. When we hear about experiments like this, we think of an energy that's being transmitted from point A to point B. And if the energy comes from one place and has to get somewhere else, you would expect that there would be a lag time, a little bit of time between when the emotion is created and when the DNA is responding. That's not what happened. What happened in these experiments, and this is very, very key to where we're going as we begin talking about the power of prayer. What happened in these experiments is that the effects were simultaneous. They were instantaneous. The instant that the donor was having his emotion, the DNA was already affected as if there were no transition time between the two. Well, these experiments were first conducted within rooms that were separated by distances of maybe 50 feet. Later experiments, however, were conducted where the DNA and the donor were separated by hundreds of miles. I had the opportunity to meet the designer of one of these experiments, Dr. Cleve Baxter, and he shared with me one of the experiments that he had designed where the donor was in Los Angeles, but the DNA was in Phoenix, Arizona, almost 400 miles apart. And the effects were precisely the same. Whether they're in the same building or separated by 400 miles, the effect is instantaneous. This opens the door to all kinds of possibilities as to how that DNA remained linked to the donor. What it says to us, once again, is that we're communicating with DNA through our emotions, and that whether the DNA is within our bodies or we're separated by distances of hundreds of miles, the effect is the same. We call this a non-local energy. It means it's everywhere all the time because the energy doesn't have to travel from point A to point B. So the third experiment was conducted again in the early 1990s by the Institute of Heart Math, a pioneering research organization based in Northern California that are exploring the human heart is much more than simply as a pump that moves blood through our bodies. And although our hearts do precisely that, it may be the least of what our hearts do. They're discovering that our hearts are the strongest magnetic field in our bodies, and the electromagnetic field that is produced by our hearts has an effect that extends well beyond our bodies. The Heart Math Institute had earlier discovered that around every human heart there is a field of energy shaped like a tube. It's called a tube torus, and extends between 5 and 8 feet beyond the human heart. And the question is, in this already acknowledged field, could there be another form of energy that is being carried by this field beyond our bodies? So they designed an experiment to test precisely this theory. There's no surprise, they took some human DNA, and they isolated the DNA and asked individuals that were trained to feel what are called coherent human emotions, very clear emotions of love, appreciation, compassion, or anger, rage, and hate, to have those feelings on demand. And as the people who were trained to have the feelings did so, they measured the way the DNA responded. And what they found was this. They found that in the presence of appreciation, love, compassion, forgiveness, the DNA became tremendously relaxed. And what we know from other experiments is that this relaxed state of DNA actually enhances our immune response. When you ask people what it is about the feelings of love and compassion that give us our high immune response, this may begin to tell us why, because the DNA is relaxed and actually allows certain portions of those little switches, if you want to think of them that way, to be enabled or turned on. And just the opposite is true as well. In the presence of anger, rage, hate, jealousy, DNA was tightened like a little knot, and it actually shut down in some instances. Those little switches depleted the immune response. Intuitively, we know this. We know that when people live in a state of jealousy or anger or rage, that it depresses those portions of our bodies, and just the opposite, love, compassion, understanding, forgiveness, that those kinds of things are enhanced. And now, perhaps for the first time, these experiments are beginning to help us to understand why. It's the effect of human emotion on what is called the conformation or the shape of the DNA in our bodies. And what these experiments showed, and what the lab results, the lab notes in the published papers actually described, was that very specific kinds of human emotion have the power to change the shape of the DNA in our bodies. This is an amazing thing to say, because what it says is that on demand, when we choose to elicit very specific kinds of feelings and emotions inside of our bodies, we actually have the power to change the way the DNA functions in our bodies. This is the beginning of an internal technology, perhaps a very ancient technology that was described in languages of our past that we're only beginning to understand. Well, each of these three experiments was interesting unto itself. In some instances, the researchers were not aware of the experiments that the other laboratories were doing. And these experiments are only representative. Other experiments have been conducted along the same lines, giving the same kinds of results. When you put them all together, however, rather than being interesting, isolated experiments, they begin to tell a story. And the story looks something like this. The first experiment, Vladimir Poponin's experiment, said that the DNA in our bodies has a direct effect on our world, on the physical stuff our world is made of on the energetic level. The last experiment shows that human emotion has the ability to change the DNA that's having an effect on the world around us. And the middle experiment, the one that was conducted by the United States Army, shows that whether we're in the same building or 400 miles apart, the effect is the same. We're not bound by space and time. And as a matter of fact, the results of the experiments are saying precisely this, that you and I have a power within our bodies that is not bound by the laws of physics the way we understand them today, that something within us linked directly to the emotion of our bodies, thoughts, feelings, our prayers, our beliefs, transcends the limits of time and space the way we begin to understand them today. Ancient traditions describe this in the language of their time. Not only do they say that we are connected to the world around us, just the way Western science is now discovering, they invite us one step further, and they say, here's how you apply it in your life. They left us very, very clear instructions saying this is the way you use this power, this inner technology within you to bring about change in your world, to bring about healing in your body, to bring about peace in your families and in your communities. And collectively, as many people come together, these principles work as peace between nations as well. And I'll share with you some of the studies that were done that describe precisely how this begins to work. One of the questions that I'm often asked with regard to this material is if these relationships exist, if they truly exist, why do we know about them today? Why doesn't Western science understand these principles? Why are we just now discovering them? Well, the answer to that question begins in our understanding that the way we view our world today, our knowledge is part of a lineage of wisdom that links us with our past. And we know that that link, the link that ties us with those who have come before us, has been broken at least 2 times in recorded history. Twice in recorded history, something happened, an event occurred, and we lost information. And in some instances, it's information pertaining precisely to what we're doing right now. The first one of those breaks was with the burning of the Great Library of Alexandria in the 4th century. While we don't know precisely what was in that library, what we do know is that Roman historians had cataloged volumes and volumes of information. Scrolls is the way that the material was written at that time. The Roman historian Callimachos, for example, cataloged over 536,000 scrolls in the Great Library of Alexandria before it was burned, and many of them were very ancient in that time, in the 4th century. And we know that the scrolls contain some of the most ancient documents of the Hebraic, ancient Hebrew traditions, of the Egyptian astronomical traditions, medical traditions, much of the wisdom that had been passed down from thousands of years earlier, describing our relationship to our world, to one another, and perhaps to something even greater. When that library burned, we know we lost tremendous amounts of information then. And the second time was with the edits of the Western biblical texts, the biblical traditions in the 4th century as well, in the year 325 AD. It was during this time in the early Christian traditions when the Emperor Constantine pulled together a council. And at that time, there was no biblical text, nice, neat, compiled text the way we see it today. It was a loose assemblage. Many of the text, the way we see it today, it was a loose assemblage. Many of the texts were redundant. Some of them were poorly written. And very few people were able to access this material. And Constantine, in an effort to make it more accessible to a broad general audience, pulled together a council within the church and said, "Counsel, make me some recommendations. What should we leave in? What should we take out? How should we arrange this material?" And the result of that was what we call today our Western biblical text, biblical tradition. We know that at least 20 books were completely removed, and another 20 to 25 were tremendously edited, and the remaining texts were condensed and rearranged into what we see today as our biblical text. So as good as our Bible is today, the best biblical scholars will openly and freely admit that it is incomplete. And we know this because we're finding these documents in places like the Dead Sea Scrolls Library. This is why they were so controversial. When we found the Dead Sea Scrolls for the first time, we were able to see many of these books in their original form. Some of them hadn't been seen for 1,700 years. And interestingly, many of the books that were edited or taken out completely are precisely the documents that describe our relationship to the universe and creation around us through the power of human emotion. So now that science is beginning to tell us in its language, ancient spiritual traditions have shown us in their way, and in our own texts and documents, we're seeing references to precisely how these principles work. The question is, how do we apply them in our lives? How do we go about making use of this relationship between thoughts, feelings, and emotions inside of our bodies and what's happening in the world around us? Well, perhaps the best place to begin is by defining what a thought and a feeling and emotion really are. I've had this conversation with my mom many, many times. And Mom always says to me, she says, "I always thought feelings and emotions were the same thing." And while they're closely related, there is a difference. So if we think of a chart, if you look at the ancient charts of the energy centers in our bodies, the chakra centers, if you will, what we see is the lower three energy centers of our bodies. They are closely associated with what we call the power of human emotion. And the ancients said we're capable of only two primary emotions. They said we're capable of the emotion of love, and whatever we believe the opposite of love really is. Whether we think of that as fear or hate. And when you get really deep into the traditions, what we find is they're actually both polarities of the same force. So in those lower centers, the power of emotion, we have two primary experiences, love and whatever we believe the opposite of love really is. This is a power. It's a force that drives us forward in life, and it tears down the walls, knocks down the barriers that stand between us and the things that we hold dear in our lives. Emotion, however, is scattered. It has to be focused. You can think of it as a power. If you know people who live strictly in their emotions, you know that sometimes their lives can be a little chaotic. Well, the emotions need to be focused, and this is where the power of thought or logic come in, and it's associated with the upper energy centers of the body. Thought is what gives focus or direction to the emotions. In other words, we have a thought about something. We have a thought about a cloudy day outside. And that thought, into that thought, we fuel the power of the emotion, either our love of that rainy day or our fear of what that rainy day may bring to us. And by doing so, when we marry the power of emotion with the direction of the thought, by virtue of that, we create a feeling. So feeling, by definition, is the union of emotion and the thought. And the one energy center, interestingly enough, that is not accounted for in all the other systems, that remains unused in these ancient systems, is the heart center, and this is the one that is dedicated to the power of feeling. We feel in our hearts. So the feeling that we have in our hearts is the language that speaks to the field that Western science is now beginning to understand through their experiments. It's the power of human feeling that is the language that opens the door to the possibilities of what we create in our world. Well, scientists today, as they think about this field, it is so new, the idea is so new, that they've yet to agree even on a single term. Some scientists call this the quantum hologram. Some call it nature's mind. Dr. Ed Mitchell, former Apollo astronaut, calls this nature's mind. Scientists like Stephen Hawking call it the mind of God. As varied as the names appear to be, they're all speaking about essentially the same field, and they describe this field as a web or a net that underlies the fabric that links everything together. And it is this fabric, this web, this net, is what we speak to with the feelings in our bodies, with the feelings in our hearts. Ancient traditions not only recognized this relationship, they invite us one step further, and they left precise instructions in terms of how we apply this in our lives. In the late 1980s, I was an engineer working in the defense and aerospace corporations. I began exploring these concepts as an engineer, looking in the world around me to understand the history of those who have come before us. And it is that thinking that led me into the journeys of some of the most amazing places in the world, from the temples in Egypt, the Andes Mountains in Bolivia and Peru, into India and Nepal, the highlands of central China and Tibet, all through the American desert Southwest, searching for information and clues that would help us to understand how we relate to the world and how we can use this power of feeling, this power that speaks the language of the world around us. So as an engineer, when I began studying the principles of those who have come before us, the information that they left so that we could understand our relationship to the world around us and this ancient technology that today we call prayer, my thinking was that this kind of information would be best preserved in places that have been least disturbed by Western civilization. And this thinking led me into a journey, first time in 1998, into the highlands of central China, into Tibet, where we had the opportunity to explore 12 monasteries and 2 nunneries, speaking through the translators to those who actually live these principles in their lives. And this is the value of going to a place like Tibet, a living culture. We can go into temples in Egypt or temples, the Mayan temples in the Yucatan, and as fascinating as they are and as much information as they hold, the cultures that left that kind of information no longer exist. So at very best, we are speculating in terms of what they're saying to us. When we go into a monastery in Tibet, we can actually speak with the people who are there. We can ask them, when we see your prayers on the outside, what are you doing on the inside? What happens? What happens to your body? What are you thinking? What are you feeling? What are you emoting? Well, it was in Tibet where I had the opportunity to meet with an abbot of one of the monasteries, and I asked him through the translator. Same thing we'd ask all of the monks and all of the nuns, and it was his answer that was so clear to me. And I asked him, when we see your prayers for 12 and 14 and 16 hours a day, when we see the mudras and the mantras and the bells and the bowls and the gongs and the chimes and the chants that you're doing in your prayers for so long on the outside, I said, what are you doing on the inside? What happens on the inside? And the abbot looked at me, and I like to think he was laughing with me, or he may have been laughing at me, because he said through the translator again, he said, you've never seen our prayers, because a prayer cannot be seen. He said, what you have seen are the things that we do to create the feeling in our bodies. And the feeling is the prayer. Then he turned the question on me, and he said, how do you do it in your culture? How do you do this in your culture? And I began to think about the way we think about prayer in our culture today. When we lost the texts that describe how the power of emotion and feeling are actually the language that connect us with the universe and the creation around us, we began to believe that words are simply the prayers. That if we say the right words, the right number of times, the right day of the year, the right time of day, that we've said the prayer. And as well-intentioned as those prayers may be, what we know is that there's a modality of prayer that carries us far beyond where simply offering the words will carry us.